we've learned to organize our playing by studying the phrase lengths in Clementi, Mozart, and Beethoven. Now we can study ways of building phrases into larger musical structures. There is a basic phrase pattern used by many composers. We call this the classic pattern. But of course, this pattern is not limited to the classical era. Here is the classic pattern. The first phrase is short, the second phrase is short, and the third phrase is long. As we will see, the classic pattern is one of the most basic, powerful building blocks of structure for composers in many different style periods and in many types of composition. Chopin's Mazurka in F major is a dance-inspired piece that uses the classic phrase pattern. We can think of the classic pattern as a way of making the music dance. In this Mazurka, the third phrase generates more musical energy, and we can imagine the dancers moving gracefully through a larger space. As Arthur Schnabel said, form is space to be conquered in one impulse, emotion put in motion, as something almost physical. We can study the classic phrase pattern in the beautiful slow movement of Beethoven's Sonata, Opus 79. In the classic phrase pattern, the third phrase is where the composer begins to build the composition, or as Arthur Schnabel put it, true genius begins with the fifth bar. The secret to interpreting the classic phrase pattern is to make sure that there is no stop in the middle of the long phrase. We must allow the music to move forward as if there were no bar lines. The first section of the very popular Brahms Intermezzo in A major, Opus 118, number 2, is almost entirely composed using the classic phrase pattern. Brahms continues with new music that uses the same pattern, but now the highest pitch has been shifted to the beginning of the long phrase. Here we need a richer and more symphonic sonority. Sometimes composers vary the basic pattern. In the Codetta, Brahms modifies the classic pattern, and we hear a beautiful new symmetrical pattern, short, short, long, short, short. Here is an example by Enrique Granados of a reverse classic phrase pattern, where the long phrase comes first and the short phrases are last. The different phrase lengths in the classic phrase pattern are like the different lengths in lines of poetry. Here is the classic phrase pattern as it appears in the famous poem by Edgar Allan Poe called The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, Arthur Schnabel thought of playing the piano as a form of musical speech. We must play as we speak, forward and upward, never downward and backward. When we study these patterns, our phrasing and performance will become more poetic, eloquent, and artistic.